the webcast. My name is Kristen Palazzolo, and I am your community manager. Today's topic is who's minding the SSO store? And today you'll be hearing from Jason Wilcox, who is a senior services architect here at CA Technologies. And we will be pausing throughout Jason's presentation today to take questions. So if you have any questions, you can wait until the breaks, or you can ask your questions and we will get to them as soon as we break in the chat window or the Q&A panel. And at the end of the webcast, we'll also allow you to unmute your lines if you'd like to ask a question over the phone. So Jason's going to present today. We'll be sharing the recording and the slides from today's webcast to the CA security community later today, and you'll also be receiving some follow-up notifications and links from us as well via email. So thank you so much, Jason, for presenting today. I'm excited to learn more about this topic.
Thank you very much. And good morning, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. So we're going to talk a little bit about who's minding the SSO store. We've all had the experience one time or another that, and the term has been coined blame minder because SSO is sitting out in the forefront of all of our critical applications. And as such, whenever something goes wrong, the first application to get blamed is always SSO. And so we want to talk a little bit about the way SSO works under the covers, the key performance indicators that need to be monitored, and a process to go through to set up a proactive monitoring solution so that you're not reacting to customer complaints, you're proactively taking control of your environment. So we're going to talk a little bit about who's talking to the policy server, why do I care, why is it important. We're going to talk a little bit about math. This is that day your 7th grade teacher always told you about, that math is going to have to come into play. Talk a little about those SSO KPIs and how you can monitor those KPIs, why it's important, and then finally wrapping it up with how to establish that proactive monitoring program. So this slide may look familiar to a lot of you that have been around SSO for a number of years. The diagram's pretty straightforward, and it's something that we've all seen and understand, right? That agents open the connections to the policy server. The policy server then optionally can close those connections. When a web agent opens the connections to the policy server, by default, under load, they can open a maximum of 20 connections, and those connections are long-lived. And by long-lived, they're not just a read and response. They open, they stay open, and they are able to be reused. On the other side of that, the policy server has the ability to close those connections. There's an idle timeout setting within the SiteMinder console that allows you to close idle connections. There's also a non-idle timeout via the agent configuration max lifetime in the XPS object. So you're able to have a lot of control over how many connections are open, how long they stay open if they're idle, and even how long they stay open if they're active. That becomes very important as you go through firewalls that might have specific rules around how long connections can stay open. Now, once an agent has that connection open, the individual sockets are synchronous connections. They do one thing at a time, and they do it very well. So once that web agent asks that question, that connection is going to be busy until the policy server responds. Now, that conversation always starts with authentication. So whenever an agent starts up, it creates an encrypted channel to the policy server. It utilizes the trusted host name and shared secret in the smhost.conf in order to create a handshake with the policy server and encrypt the channel, retrieve its operational parameters from the host configuration object, and part of those operational parameters are the number of connections that agent's able to open, and then retrieve information about its configurational parameters from the ACO or optionally from the local configuration. So this is where we're able to go in and tune those connection parameters as best for our environment. Once that connection is open and the agent's functioning, there's 3 basic questions that the agent asks the policy server. Is this resource protected? Is this user authenticated? And is this user authorized to access this resource? Those aren't the only commands the agent asks, but those are the key commands that every day we deal with and every day the agent is constantly going through and processing. And those are the ones we really focus on when we look at the performance of the agent. Now, the other side of that is the policy server. So when an agent comes knocking, the policy server's reactor thread is who accepts that initial request. And all that reactor thread does is simply put the request on a queue for the worker threads to actually take that off the queue and do the work. Now, the worker threads are a very, very key factor in the performance of an SSO policy server. Okay? We have the ability to configure the worker threads, and by default, our maximum number of threads is 20. I will tell you right now that's a default setting. You're free to increase that setting. In fact, many times when CA Services comes in and does a health check of an environment, we find that the maximum threads is set too low, and we increase that maximum thread count. You'll see some strategies in here in just a minute about how many threads you actually need and how to calculate that value and then monitor that value real time. So let's talk about what the worker threads do. It's pretty straightforward. They do the work. Okay? They take an item off of that queue and they go to the user store, the policy store, the session store, cache, etc., and they do the work of the policy server. That might be authenticating a user. It might be generating assertions for a SAML request. It might be processing some XML. Whatever happens within the policy server, the worker threads are the ones that actually execute it and do it. But as worker threads get busy, we get into a scenario where every single request that a thread takes, that thread is busy until the request is completed. So a thread is completely locked during that time. So just like an agent, when the request comes through a socket, that socket is busy until the policy server responds. A worker thread is busy until it's finished with its task. For example, if a worker thread needs to do an isAuthenticate call, it's going to go out to the LDAP directory. It's going to do an LDAP search to find the user DN, and then it's going to do an LDAP bind. But until it's completed with all of those tasks, it's going to be marked as busy. Now, that's an example of multiple LDAP calls needed to make a synchronous, to perform a single task, and those LDAP calls are always processed in a synchronous manner. So if you're looking at an authorization where it needs to go out and check group memberships, for instance, it's going to go out and check those group memberships. That authorization could easily trigger responses being generated, so that same thread is going to go out there and gather those responses and bring them back. During this time, that thread can't be used for anything else. It's essentially blocked. So, quick and easy introduction to what's happening underneath the covers in a policy server, right? So what do we know so far? We know that the agents initiate that secure connection to the policy server. Each agent connection takes up a socket on the policy server, and each agent connection performs a task, and while that task is being performed, it's busy, and it can't be used for other things. On the other side, we have that policy server that receives those requests via the reactor thread. The reactor thread puts those requests in a queue so that work can be done on those by the worker threads, and just like an agent connection, the worker threads are blocked until that task they're performing is completed. But we also have control on both sides of that equation. So we have control over the agent connections that can be made to the policy server, the number of sockets that the policy server can accept and have open, and the lifetime of each of those connections. We also have control over the number of threads that we have, but what we don't have control over is how long it takes to complete each of those tasks. So does that make sense? Everybody understand where we're at so far?
We have
Sure,
one question coming in from Prashant. I don't see it yet. There we go. If a copy shared secret from one server to another server without doing registration, will it work?
And that is a great question. And it depends on a few different things. The version of, so you really wouldn't be, you don't want to ever copy just the shared secret. You'll be copying the entire smhost.conf. Okay. In the Windows platform, copying the entire smhost.conf will function properly, and it'll be able to be reused. On the Linux and Unix platforms, it'll really depend on the version of the policy server you're running and the version of the agent that registered it. So the encryption of the shared secret on Windows is always going to come across and be encrypted the same. On Linux, there is local information that, depending on the version of the policy server and agent that was used to encrypt that shared secret. So best practice is re-register it on Windows, on Linux machines always, probably should on Windows as well.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks for the question, Prashant. All right, so let's talk a little bit about math. Okay? Math actually matters, and when we're talking about a policy server and the performance of the policy server and building a predictive model for performance capacity, math becomes very, very key to understanding the behavior of the policy server. We also have to understand the impacts of throughput on that model and the impacts of latency then on that throughput. It's not just a matter of, well, a request comes in, gets processed and done. There's a lot that happens behind the scenes, and we really have to understand each of those items to understand what those key performance indicators are to be able to understand what we should be managing and monitoring and reported on as we move forward. So let's talk about the things that we need to build that model. Number one is throughput. Pretty simple with that, okay? The total number of transactions per second that the policy server can fulfill, okay? You have a target, okay? Can you get your policy server to actually process that number of transactions per second? We also have to take in consideration latency. How long does each transaction take to be processed? And there's two different types of latency that are very closely related, but it's important to understand whether each one is causing a problem. There's thread latency, so how long before a worker thread pulls that request from the queue, and then there's execution latency of how much time does it actually take that worker thread to process the request. Now, execution latency can cause thread latency, but in the end, there's still two very distinct items that have to be managed and understood. So let's talk about that relationship of threads, throughput, and latency. Okay? Because on any system with a set number of threads, throughput and latency are interrelated. Okay? As latency goes up, the throughput has to go down. As throughput goes down, additional requests are queued, causing increased latency. Okay? So it's a delicate balance managing those together. So there's an algorithm we can use, right? A simple function here is maximum server throughput is the number of threads over the average transaction time. And anytime we're looking at capacity planning, anytime we're looking at understanding a model for alerting and proactively monitoring your system, that simple figure is the key piece of information we need to understand. What is our maximum throughput? And it's equal to the number of threads in the average transaction time. So we have complete control over the number of threads, but we don't have control over the thread or execution latency, both of which are things that we have to be able to manage. So there's two primary reasons for the policy server throwdown. Too many agent API requests coming from the policy server, coming in for the policy server, or the response time from the user directory. Now, there are other things out there that can affect this, but these are the two primary reasons we see policy server slowdown and we see users complaining about poor performance. So if too many agent API requests are coming in, that thread latency is going to increase, right? There aren't enough threads to service those requests in a timely manner, and so they're going to begin to wait, and they're going to continue to wait longer and longer. Also, of course, if the response time for the user directory increases, then execution latency is going to increase. So if our average response time for the directory was 10 milliseconds, it goes up to 15 milliseconds. Everything's taking 50% longer, and that in turn could cause thread latency to increase as well because it's taking longer to process each request. So let's talk about the use case where too many agent API requests are coming in. One of the most common things that people misunderstand about SSO is that a single web page does not mean a single agent request. In today's world, a single web page is made up of multiple components, multiple pieces and parts, and each one of those parts can trigger a web agent request. Okay, so just saying a page view equals a request isn't at all accurate. In fact, we find that a single page view can generate 7 to 10 individual web agent requests back to the policy server, validating whether each individual piece of the page is protected and whether or not they're authorized. HCO settings limit the number of agent connections per agent instance on a server. Okay, so we have an agent sitting out there, but through the ACO, we're limiting by default that agent to have 20 connections to the policy server. So if you're flooding that web server with a lot of traffic, it's still only got those 20 max connections that it can talk to the policy server. And so now we're going to see that if you're getting too much traffic at the front end, we're going to have some latency in being able to communicate with the policy server. Increasing the number of agent connections to the policy server can help alleviate that, but then you've got to do some math on the back end. Okay, so a single server running multiple web agent instances is going to generate that max connections, that 20 per instance. Okay, and if we remember, our policy server by default can only accept 1,024 connections. So it's important to do that math up front and understand that number of agents instances, and the key thing here is agent instances, because if you're running multiple web servers on a single physical box, each one can have its own connection pool. So the number of agent instances times 20 are the number of connections coming back to that policy server. One of the more common things we see is customers will build out hundreds of agents in front of an individual policy server, and at normal load, they're fine because they're maybe only sitting using 5 or 6 connections at a time. But when they have huge load spikes and all of those agents peak immediately to their 20 connections, they now have the potential to generate 2,000 to 3,000 connections to the policy server, where it's configured only to manage 1,000 connections at a time. So let's talk about, I know we got some questions piling up, and that's great. We're going to go through a couple more slides, and we'll be able to get to them. So let's talk a little bit about directory latencies, throughput, and how it affects performance. Okay. So now we've got to use that math again. Okay. So let's make some assumptions. So we've got 15 threads. Okay. An average of 7 LDAP queries per transaction, and by the way, that is what our average has been historically over the years. An average LDAP response time plus the network latency of 10 milliseconds. Okay, so if you've got an LDAP server that's responding in 4 milliseconds for its request, there's still network latency, there's still processing time. 10 milliseconds is a good number to start with. And if our goal is 125 transactions per second per policy server, okay, we can simply do that math, right? We know we have 15 threads. We know we have 7 transactions. We know we can do each transaction's 10 milliseconds. So the average transaction time has to be at least 70 milliseconds. We're going to add on some processing time so we get 100 milliseconds per transaction. At 15 threads, 100 milliseconds, we can do 150 transactions per second. But if that LDAP performance increases to just 15 milliseconds rather than 10, our maximum throughput drops almost by a third. Okay? That's why these calculations become so important as you're planning the capacity of your environment, but also as you're proactively managing that environment. Because you're very easily able to sit down and look and say, gee, based on the number of requests coming in right now and my performance of my user store, I know that I'm at 80% of my maximum throughput. I might need to take action today rather than wait until users begin complaining. So how do we keep that transactional latency low? Right-sizing the connections, okay? Right-sizing the threads and the agent ratio for load and hardware. Okay? We minimize custom and third-party code. Anything that makes an extra call out while that thread is processing is going to add additional time. Okay? So while for our calculation, we assumed a 10 millisecond response time per LDAP call, but if you've got a custom code that needs to make a call out to another database as well, that adds time onto it. Use smart LDAP searches and optimize database queries. Okay? So if you're doing LDAP directories, reverse group lookups are always faster than a group lookup. Okay? Nested groups are always significantly slower than flat groups. Hierarchical trees are always slower than a flat tree. Things like that make a big deal when you're looking at the performance of that user store. On the database side, the same things, right? Try to create a view and base queries off of that view rather than large queries based on multiple joined tables. Okay? All of those things improve the performance of the lookups, reduce your latency, and increase your throughput. Keep agent to policy server and policy server to user directories over fast connections and when possible in the same data center. Okay? Now, if you have a choice, a lot of customers put agents nearest their or put policy servers where their agents are, but leave the user directory behind. The exact opposite is always the best practice. Okay, you want your policy server as close to your user store and any other database it accesses as possible, because that's where most of the latency is going to impact their performance. And of course, work with the directory teams to ensure that directories are performing not just as required, but as optimally as possible. So, what do we know? Thread latency can absolutely be affected by a large volume of requests. When you have spikes come in, your thread latency is always going to go up. Can be affected by high execution latency. So when our backend slows down, our thread latency is going to increase. And you have to do the math in advance to right size for those expected peak loads. Execution latency is directly impacted by poor policy design. Okay? So if you're doing nested group lookups, it's going to increase your execution latency. Most of the time, SSO is the victim, right? So if your directory is performing slow, SSO is the victim in that case, but unless you can prove it, it really doesn't matter. And finally, increasing the number of threads isn't always the answer, okay? So if we increase the threads, we start with 20 threads and we increase them to 50, but our back-end directory is still performing slowly, all we've done now is increase the number of locked threads rather than actually increasing throughput. That's why all of these pieces come together. And then we can model throughput to properly plan for capacity. We can model what even a small change in the network or directory performance is going to do. But the important thing is using these models to become proactive and predictive. And we're going to cover those items in the next section, but we've got several questions.
Again, if you have any questions, you can ask them in the chat window or the Q&A window, and we will get to those as soon as we can on the break. I do see more questions coming in. Let me see a few questions that were asked during the break. I was able to answer. One was, would it be possible to send us a copy of the deck after the meeting? Yes, I will be sending an email out to everyone after the subcast with a link to the deck and the replay. All right, one question. In a gateway SPS configuration, would the number of agent threads equal the number of policy threads?
Derek, so it kind of depends on the way you're asking that. So are you saying, in general, the answer going to be that is no, okay? SPS configuration is going to be completely separate from the policy server threads. SPS is somewhat unique, however, in that you've got flexibility in how it can be configured. By default, most people configure a single agent instance within SPS, so the single HCO for that SPS server is going to manage the number of connections, right? So by default, that's going to be 20 connections coming in. The number of policy server threads is always going to be less than the number of connections. If for no other reason, the policy server can handle, depending on size and such, 8,000 connections. But our recommendation on the number of threads is significantly less. In fact, kind of a rule of thumb is 4 threads per processor core that the policy server is exposed to. On the high end, we see customers, 50 to 100 max threads, but connections are at several thousand. But with SPS, you also have the ability to run multiple instances and therefore have multiple agent instances. So the number of connections coming from an SPS server can be greater than just that max of 20 that you've configured. Does that make sense to you, Derek?
Yes, thanks. Another question came in. To get the maximum throughput, should we use round robin or failover mode to our policy server and our HCO?
All right, great question. This will depend on 2 things, okay? Number 1 is, by default, you'll want to use clusters, okay? So if you've got more than 2 policy servers, configure them in a cluster, because within a cluster, we're going to round robin within that cluster and then fail over to another cluster, okay? But if you've only got 2 or 3 policy servers, okay, so you don't have enough to make more than 1 cluster, you'll always want to round robin within those policy servers. The only way, if you're not using clusters, that I would ever look at failover is if those policy servers are in different data centers, okay? And then you wouldn't want to be round robbing across data centers if you can avoid it. But your first choice is clustering. Second choice is round robin within an individual data center. Failover is only when you're going to cross data centers, or if you've specifically architected your solution so the policy servers are specialized. So that maybe you have some policy servers that are only doing authentication, some that are only doing federation. Okay. All right, let's move on. All right, so we've talked about what's happening behind the scenes, what's happening inside the guts of the policy server. But we need to be able to monitor some of that information. We need to understand how to get at that information so that we can build those predictive models, so that we can build a monitoring system that alerts us before the customer finds out there's a problem. And so we need to identify what those KPIs are so we can build that predictive model for performance and capacity and begin alerting on those APIs. We have to understand those impacts of throughput on that model, and we've actually already really talked about the impacts of the latency on the throughput. And then using this, we can identify those KPIs that should be proactively monitored, managed, and reported on. So what are the things that we need to track? okay? It's a big list, all right? So on the user store access, we want to understand the max queue length, the average authorization time, the average is protected time, the agent transaction times. Across the board, we want to think, you know, and by the way, this is user store access is one of the things we want to monitor. Policy store access is something we want to monitor, the individual time it takes as we make each one of those requests. Our cache miss rates, our SOC accounts, our normal and high priority queue lengths, the average authentication and validation times. All of these individual KPIs become critical to monitoring the system. The importance of those APIs depends on what you're doing with SSO and how big your deployment is and what the variance in use of that SSO solution is. But these are the key pieces of information that you need to be able to manage in order to understand your environment. So there's a few different ways that we can monitor those SSO KPIs, okay? Everything from the SiteMinder Trace tool, OneView Monitor, CA APM for SSO. There's even third-party tools that utilize things such as SNMP and event plugins in order to be able to get at that data and proactively monitor that data. So the SiteMinder Trace tool, okay? This is a post-performance solution, right? I'm not sure I'd necessarily call it monitoring as much as it is tracking information. Okay? It allows you to load and parse logs across all of the CA SSO components. If you haven't seen this tool, it's available on the community site, and I greatly recommend you download it and start looking at it. It's able to generate reports that detail performance of your SSO system for that point in time, okay? But also very good at identifying potential bottlenecks. So this isn't something that's going to be out there monitoring all the time and sending you alerts, but it is something that you can take and import your logs, process those logs, and take a look at the reports to understand how your system is performing, but more importantly, to understand where potential bottlenecks are and optimize those bottlenecks. OneView Monitor is a tool that ships with SSO. Now, OneView Monitor is great for a point in time. This is how it's performing right this minute, right this second. It centrally gathers all of those KPIs that I listed into a single console so you can look at those values, okay? It gathers data from both agents and policy servers, and it's able to centrally gather that data. So all of your policy servers can report to a single OneView Monitor. To be able to get the most value out of OneView Monitor, you actually need to record that data manually and graph it yourself. Okay? And we do have customers that do, that go in there and have a spreadsheet, and somebody goes in there first thing in the morning and a couple other times throughout the day and looks at those key performance indicators, tracks them in a spreadsheet, and produce graphs on it. And it's a very good tool at looking at those pieces of data. But once again, it's just point in time. There's no built-in trending. There's no built-in graphing. And more importantly, there's no built-in alerting. Okay, step up from that, we've got CA APM for SSO. Okay, and we like to say this is when you prefer those KPIs kind of wrapped in a bow and handed to you. Okay, so there's built-in dashboards specifically for CA SSO. You can know instantly if there's a problem and utilize APM to actually drill down for real-time root cause analysis of the problem. This isn't where you have to go get the data and analysis comes to you, and there's built-in alerting, so it keeps you ahead of the customers. So that when something begins to slow down, you can take action before it actually impacts the customer. And this is just a sample dashboard of APM for SSO. You can see it graphing the login response time, authorization times, validation response times, okay? And building multiple thresholds for alerting allows you to alert before you reach a failure point. But that's not the only way it can be done, okay? One of the most infrequently used capabilities of CA SSO is our SNMP data that's made available. So if you install SNMP and you make it available as make that data available, any tool can utilize SNMP to get access to over 60 different objects that report performance data. Okay, so all of those KPIs are accessible via SNMP. 17 different events that are available that can be sent via an SNMP trap. And depending on the tool that you're then using, present that data how you want it to be presented. I should clarify for CA APM for SSO is not part of the policy server. It is another product from CA that's part of our application performance monitoring suite that specifically targets SSO. In fact, all of the data that's available in APM is also published via SNMP. And we've got customers out there right now using tools like Splunk, like HP OpenView, and I'm trying to think, there was another one that a customer just showed to me last week, that are using this SNMP data in order to build some very, very sophisticated analysis of the performance of their SSO system. Problem is, people don't realize that it's there and available. And then there's also third-party tools that exist today. So one of our partners, Identity Logics, has a product called Spylogic for CA SSO. And it's a CA certified solution for SSO that's become the full analytics platform for SSO. Has numerous built-in dashboards for performance, systems management, utilization, really focused on mean time to recovery of your system. Okay, but I present this one to show you the power of the data that's available to you to be able to monitor and manage SSO. Okay? The data's always been there. Customers haven't always looked at SSO in the same way they look at other mission-critical tools to be able to jump in and grab that data and utilize it, but it's there and available to us to utilize. So the next question I always get is, why does it matter? How does this data really help me? Okay. So if users are complaining about slow SSO performance, what's the definition of slow? Can you show what the performance of SSO is to combat that impression? So one of my favorite things to do with customers is to roll out a tool such as even the SM test tool that's bundled with the policy server and show them what a raw authentication looks like. So if I can show them a raw authentication is taking 30 milliseconds, but the overall authentication process when they go to a login page, submit their credentials, and get to the applications page takes 20 seconds, okay? Without the tools to actually identify what slow is and how the policy server performance is, it's hard to defend SSO and say, well, we're not really the problem there, okay? So it's nice to be able to ask them, does their definition of slow include the load time for the application page? Are you able to show them that without that load time of the application page, you're performing fine or not? And can you show that historical evidence of performance and stability? Okay. So customers that are using things like APM for SSO that can have a graph that shows, hey, gee, for the last 6 months, here's been our performance trend. And you'll notice today it's no different than it was yesterday, 30 days, 90 days ago. That allows you to do two things. Number one, defend the solution and show that it's performing well, but more importantly, to focus the troubleshooting effort on where the problem really is, okay? So if you've got access to these KPIs and you've been tracking these KPIs, you're able to get a faster mean time to resolution by knowing immediately whether the problem is SSO or not SSO, okay? Without access to these KPIs and without monitoring, you're unable to pinpoint where that problem actually is. Okay, just some examples of the type of information you can get out of the tools, right? So this is showing customer queue depth, all right? So from the trace tool, okay, I'm able to see that the queue depth is consistently rising over a period of time, okay? This tells me, yeah, the policy server could be having a problem. We need to dig deeper and look into it. The exact same data shown from the APM for SSO gives us a little bit different look at the ups and downs that are occurring. But once again, once you've baselined your system and you understand that performance pattern, you're able to view and determine, is it load-based or is it the back end that can't keep up? Am I even having a problem today? So now that we know that there may be an issue, the question is what's causing it? How do we determine which of the two conditions the policy server is in? Are we queuing the request because there's too many incoming requests? Or are we queuing a request because the transactions are taking too long to process? Okay. How do we answer those questions? How can we easily get and review the transaction times for the user store, review the socket usage, review the total operations, and the total spikes? Okay. So once again, we go back to those KPIs. Okay. So if we look at the SM Trace tool, it's actually going to show us the distribution of time for LDAP requests. Okay. We can see that the majority of the requests took under 2 milliseconds. But there's a whole bunch of outliers out here that took significantly longer. Okay. So this is something that if we're able to proactively monitor and understand, we now know that these caused execution latency. These transactions could have very easily caused transactional latency across the board. And if we were using a proactive monitoring system, we'd be able to actually identify and alert on these type of transactions before the customers determined that there was a problem. Okay, APM SSO showing some of the same information. Okay, but because we're using APM for SSO, we're able to be alerted to that data. Grabbing that data out of SNMP, feeding it into your existing monitoring solution, same type of performance, right? You're able to analyze this data before the customers notice the problem. So we have to look at establishing a proactive monitoring program, okay? We can't rely on user errors to tell us there's a problem because by then it's too late, okay? We have to have that data readily available to advertise SSO success. It's no longer sufficient to just be able to give an uptime count for SSO, okay? We have to be able to dig in and tell people the actual performance time of our SSO solution, okay? And that's what a proactive monitoring program helps you be able to do, okay? Why? Because SSO is mission critical, touches everything across the enterprise, both internal and external customer actions. If SSO stops, application stops, okay? When a problem occurs, we must know why so we can take action and take action immediately. Without a proactive monitoring solution, the mean time to resolution slows down dramatically because now we need to start digging through logs to understand what happens. From an organizational perspective, we need to identify problems quickly. Okay, single sign-on crosses multiple teams, the application team, the directory team, the single sign-on team. And within most organizations, when a problem occurs, it's always finger pointing. So as no, the problem's over here, the problem's over there. But because single sign-on touches across all of them, that's where Blame Minder comes into play. And that's why having access to these KPIs becomes critically important to be able to not shift the blame, but quickly pinpoint where the problem is actually relying. Okay, so we talked about tools that are used to monitoring, but there's more to monitoring than just a tool, okay? There's multiple types of monitoring, components that are up and down, the health of the system, user activity, administrative activity, and a complete comprehensive proactive monitoring program has to incorporate elements across the board of all of these different types of solutions, okay? So there's synthetic transactions, right? Where a tool automatically does a login and accesses a page so they can see the site from an end user perspective, okay? A lot of tools out there become geographically distributed, okay? And you have to be careful when they're geographically distributed because sometimes, in fact, fairly often, geographically, one of those components could very easily be down and triggering false positives, okay? You also have to be very careful of the monitor becoming the biggest user of the system, okay? But I've been in multiple customers where the SSO team has a synthetic monitor going and it's logging in every 5 minutes to make sure that SSO is up. And every single application that it's protecting has a synthetic monitor logging in every 5 minutes to make sure SSO is up, okay? Well, you get to a point where if you're protecting 200 applications, you've now got 200 users, quote unquote, logging in every 5 minutes just to make sure SSO is up, okay? Those can actually have a real world impact on the performance of the solution, especially during peak hours when you're just moving things right over the top, okay? Now, obviously, CA has a product, CA App Synthetic Monitor, that does this, but that's not the only one out there. There's several free solutions that are out there. There's a lot of SaaS-based solutions that are out there that are low cost and very effective at doing this. One of the nice things is if you use a CA suite, as you use the different components of our APM suite, you've got a centralized dashboard for all of them, okay? But any synthetic transaction is going to tell you whether or not the website is responding to logins. It's going to give you some login transaction and first page load times. It's important to remember that that's not an authentication time. That's an end user experience of the authentication. So web server performance, network, and various other things come into play on that. Looks across the entire site, okay? So you're able to generate synthetic transactions that aren't just looking at SSO alone. Drawbacks, unknown what the path is for the transaction, okay? So we don't necessarily know what policy server it hit, what agent it hit, what directory it hit. We just know here's the time that it took. And as I discussed, it can take a little bit more time or create extra load on a system. One tip, creating a single website on each policy server with a single agent that only communicates to that policy server. So if you're going to do synthetic monitoring for an SSO system as the SSO team, creating a single website that's just communicating with a single policy server and monitoring that lets you know for sure that that policy server is up and functional. And so you can get very granular with that synthetic monitor. Things like the server error file ACO setting. So the ACO has a setting called server error file that allows you to put in a URL to redirect to a page that is going to display a friendly message. Well, use that redirect ability to redirect to a JSP page, an ASP page, some sort of dynamic page that reads the query string and the HTTP headers and logs all those errors, okay? Very, very simple way to log errors that occur when users are trying to access pages, okay? A lot of the times we don't see what the SSO error is. Either the browser's hidden it or the user just reports that they had an error, and we have to start digging through agent logs and policy server logs in order to try to find out what that transaction was. But utilizing the server error file ACO setting, every single error coming from an agent, the user can be redirected and it can be logged in its own file. So you've got much less to go through. And then proactively analyze that file on a regular basis. I always prefer weekly, and look for common errors and start to diagnose those errors in advance rather than waiting until the business comes to us. Actually just went through all of this in the explanation. I think one of the biggest things is if you're not analyzing that data, there's no value to it, right? Great, you've displayed a friendly error message, you've captured the data, but if it sits there for years, does it really matter? We actually had one customer who took this example to heart, and they implemented server error file, and everybody got redirected to a JSP page that captured and dumped them all into a table. Okay, so they had it all going to a database. It had been running for a couple of years, and nobody had ever looked at that database until it got to a point where the size of the table, they were asking if it needed to be extended. Nobody had ever looked at it, cleaned it out, and done anything with it. So they did all the work to capture the data. but got no value out of the work that they did. You can also get deep into network visualization, right? So looking at the network layer monitoring, tools like CA SSO that actually looks at the packet level and looks at performance bottlenecks, okay? Now, we've all probably experienced times where we've had to plug in a sniffer to try to understand what's going on with SSO and maybe with failed connections or with performance problems between different points. ADA is always there and running and actually would have that data readily available, so you don't have to plug in a sniffer, so you don't have to dive in and look. Gives you a very, very detailed view of latency of communications between multiple components. So if you've got a very large implementation spread out across multiple data centers, this is the type of tool that becomes very, very good for you to utilize. Able to very quickly identify components that might be having trouble and identify if it's a network or an application component. Once again, not part of SSO, completely separate product. Not specific to SSO, in fact, even. It's a general use product, and definitely overkill in smaller environments. Okay. And so we've talked about what those KPIs are. We've talked about different ways to monitor those KPIs, whether it's OneView, APM, SNMP, Spylogic. They're all a component of a comprehensive monitoring solution. Often this is a missing component in a comprehensive monitoring solution, right? We don't look at the KPIs, we're just looking at up and down. So as you look at building that comprehensive solution, baseline your environment, okay? Doesn't matter what tool you're utilizing to gather that KPI data, you need to baseline your environment, okay? Let it run without alerting for a couple weeks to understand what it is. Try to focus on a time frame that'll span key peak usage periods, okay? So if you've got an application or a system that has monthly or quarterly spikes, try to include that in your baselining, okay? Because it's important to know what the top end as well as the bottom end is. And discuss the goals with your customers and stakeholders, okay? They often have a lot of insights into their applications and their utilization that you may not readily know and have access to. Step 2 is creating habits to review the data, okay? A lot of customers put out monitoring, but they don't create the habit to review that data. You have to carve out that time. It helps identify new areas for coverage. Okay, so you may be looking at errors, but you don't know how they got there because you're not monitoring that area. Identifies previously unknown and unmonitored errors, and the more you review a system, the better you know that system. So it's critically important to look at logs, to look at those data, to really understand your system and the importance of it. As new errors are found, create a knowledge base and keep it updated. Okay. There's no reason not to share data. Okay? As you share data, you learn more, and everybody in your organization learns more. Part of the reason why CA Communities is up there, so that customers can share data with each other. And incentivize finding new items. And this actually came from one of our customers that they had a bounty. Think of it as a bug bounty, but it was an error bounty. They had a bounty for their team. Anytime their team found a new error in a log, diagnosed the error and wrote a knowledge base article, they were rewarded for doing so. So not only was part of their job, they were incentivized to go out and do it. Step 3, create alerts based on that baseline data, okay? So create alerts when the performance is degraded more than X%. Okay, and what X is something that's going to be specific to your environment. Okay, create a critical alert when it degrades more than X plus X. All right, so maybe you're sitting there and you're looking at 10% performance degradation. You want to know, so you're going to be warned. But boy, if you degrade 20%, you want to alert and you want to start telling people, hey, we've got a potential problem. Okay. But you always want to warn so the team can act before that problem occurs, before that alert. Alert broad and wide. Transparency builds trust, trust builds confidence. Too often customers don't, or too often SSO teams don't let customers know that, hey, you know, we're having a little problem here. You're not having an outage, but we noticed a small issue. We're letting you know now, and we'll keep you informed, okay? If you're transparent, your customers will trust you more, and they'll have confidence in what you're able to do. And then continue to fine-tune those alerts, okay? Each and every quarter, review how many alerts you got, determine which ones were actually actionable alerts, and fine-tune them to try to get the best of information out of them. And then finally, step 4, create some dashboards. Okay? Create dashboards to help your team stay on top of the situation. They should identify the most critical items and put them first. They should identify the most troublesome items and put them in second. And then make sure everyone on the team knows how to get to those dashboards and read them. And our last type is advertise, engage, and sell, okay? Create dashboards for your customer. Let them see information about your solution. Let them see the performance that you're able to execute. You know, a lot of times customers only look at SSO when there's a problem, and that's part of the problem. Let them see the value that SSO is providing every single day, not the problems that it provides one day a year. Create an executive report and send it out regularly to your customers in their chain of command. Okay? Advertise that success and consider a subscription model to your successes and challenges. Okay? Internal Twitter feeds are a fabulous thing. Okay? Utilizing those to communicate with your customers and allow them to subscribe to that communication, and putting both successes and failures on that subscription, once again, helps build that trust and confidence in the solution. All right. Let's go ahead and open it up to any questions.
Yeah, we got a lot in here. Thank you, Jason. First question, can CA APM, is CA APM part of CA Policy Server, or is it a different component?
CA APM is a separate product, and there's actually CA APM, which is a very large product. And then there's also CA APM for SSO, which is still a separate product, but specifically targeted at SSO.
Okay, another question. There was an analytics tool CA was presenting at CA World last year. Is it available for CA SSO?
Not at this time. There is a lot of work coming, and of course, you know, with CA World being right around the corner here next week, there could be some announcements, but there's not a new analytics tool for CA SSO today.
Okay. All right, I just opened up a poll if you guys can rate today's webcast. The next question, I see below errors in web agent logs, LLA, SiteMinder agent API function failed, SM agent API is protected, X returned, -2. Do you see that in the Q&A
Yep.
panel? Okay. Does that mean WA not able to communicate to policy server, and doesn't that cause error intermittently in login? How to avoid this error? I see many of these errors.
Okay. And Kit, I would have to actually know a little bit more about exactly what was going on to be able to diagnose specifically what was happening in that case. Agent API -2, yeah, there's about 4 different things it could be, and we don't have time to get into all 4 right now. But I'll tell you what, if you want to, as soon as we're done with this, send me an email at jason.wilcox@ca.com with that question, and we can start a quick dialogue, and I'll see if I can't get you a quick answer. Does that work for you?
Yes, TISA, yes.
Great.
Okay. Can we set up alerts using Trace tool?
Trace tool can't be set up to generate alerts. It's just a point in time reading log files and generating a report based on those log files. There's no alerting capabilities.
Is there documentation for the objects/events available via SNMP and how to implement this?
There's absolutely some documentation. So, yeah, absolutely there's some documentation that exists. It is within the product documentation in DocOps. I would start there. There's also a white paper, and I will find the white paper on that and actually post a link to it in the communities forum later on today that goes in a little more in detail about how to set up SNMP and then how to query SNMP data.
Okay. Can Spylogic's third-party tool be configured to issue alerts?
Yes, it can.
Okay.
And I encourage you to reach out to them at identitylogics.com if you're interested. Take a look at the tool. Our partners do a great job of adding value to our solutions.
Identitylogics.com?
Yes.
I'll post that link in the chat window.
I'm going to say it's spelled oddly, though.
Yeah, I got it. LOGIX.
Okay. Yep.
Very cool. Does enabling full detailed logs in policy server and agents affect the performance?
Absolutely, it does. One of the things that best practices that I really strongly recommend customers to do is on the policy server, always leave profiling enabled, but leave it enabled with very minimal logging. And then build a full debug template. And when you've got a problem, switch to that full debug template, run it for a period of time to try to capture as much data as you can, and then switch it back to your minimal template. Switching between templates doesn't require a restart of the policy server, but at full debug, it's a very significant performance impact, and so you don't want to be doing that all the time.
Okay, great. Awesome. All right, I don't see any other questions in there at this time. If you guys have any other questions, you can ask them in the chat window or the Q&A panel. You can also unmute your line by pressing #6 or *6, or I can unmute your line for you if you're connected to the web audio if you press the phone icon with a question mark. Yes, if you have any other questions, someone just asked if we can reach out over email. I'm going to send out a follow-up email to everyone who attended this webcast today, and you can respond directly to that email if you have any additional questions, and I can make sure those get to Jason so he can respond. How would you recommend which operating system is good for policy server setup? Windows or Linux?
I would say the very first determination is what is your organizational comfort, okay? I am not one that believes that Windows is any better than Linux or vice versa when it comes to what a policy server can do, because when it comes right down to it, the policy server is a glorified string parser, and it's going to perform equally well on either platform. So focus on what your organization is best able to support, what you're personally best able to support, and then you can start looking at things like cost, you know, and what other tools you have surrounding that platform. But from an SSO perspective, you're great either way.
It said we are comfortable with which is best work for policy server. I guess, were they just clarifying? Okay. How do you calculate threshold percentage in HCO when we configure policy server in round robin mode?
So in round robin mode, you don't have a threshold percentage. So the threshold percentage is only for failover between clusters in an HCO, so you wouldn't need to utilize it. Now, when you are using clusters, okay, I'm one of those that I like odd numbers in my clusters, okay? So I like policy server clusters of 3 policy servers or 5 policy servers, never 2, never 4, okay? And at that point, I typically will look at when 2 have failed, so 66%, I'm going to fail over. That way, any 2 are running, you're probably still fine. But in a pure round-robin mode, that calculation isn't used. Every request goes to the next policy server in the list.
Okay, great. All right. Well, let's wrap this up. We're about 6 minutes over schedule today. Lots of great questions. So thank you, Jason, and thank you, everyone, for your participation and your feedback. We will be announcing new webcasts very shortly for the SSO community and the CA security community, so stay tuned. I'll be sending out an email once again to everyone with a link to the replay and the slides from today's webcast. And if you have any additional questions or if you have any suggestions about future community webcast topics, feel free to reply directly to that email. It goes right to me, and I will make sure that that gets to the product team. Thank you, Jason, and thank you, everyone. Have a great day and a great rest of your week.
Thanks all. I hope to see some of you at CA World next week.
Yeah, enjoy CA World if you're going. I won't be there, but I'll be streaming live from the live stream online. All right, bye everyone. Yes, I will be sending out the deck from today's session.